So here's the question I want answering. Is Ryzen 5 5600X, which is the lowest of the 5000 series CPUs, not APUs, and a mid-range GPU, which is RTX 3070 by NVIDIA, a combo of these two, is it enough to be a good enough of a editing or creator PC? That's why I have called this the Silent ProArt, and I want to know, how does it perform in creative benchmarks? Is this enough? Let's find out right after this.
Are you sick of seeing activate Windows message on your desktop? Well, it's time to activate your Windows and do it cheap. Go on to whokeys.com where you can find official license keys. If you're looking for Windows 10 Pro key, for example, then all you have to do is search for Windows 10 Pro, select the license and add it to the basket. Use the code TN20 to get a 20% discount. Once you have the license key on your email, click here, type in your license key, hit activate, and you're all done. Check out whokeys.com in the description below, and don't forget to use the code TN20 to get a 20% discount.
By the way, if you're wondering why is it called Silent ProArt, well, two reasons. First of all, it is super silent. By the way, this right now is running Cinebench R23 back-to-back multi-core test, so all the CPU is 100% utilized. And can you hear it? No, it's hardly making any noise. If you don't believe me, I'll show you on this side of the camera. Can you see Cinebench running here? And second of all, why ProArt? Well, because we're using the Asus B550 ProArt motherboard, which is a beast of a motherboard and offers like Thunderbolt 4, one of the only motherboards in the world. Well, as far as I know, only two of them offered Thunderbolt 4. It's just amazing thing, and together it's like silent and it's meant for creators. So first of all, let's have a look at Cinebench R23, which is basically a rendering test of single core and multi-core. Now, in terms of the single core, we're getting quite a good score, which is 1472, and it beats out any of the previous Ryzen processors and even Intel's 10th generation of processors. So if you look at the Intel 10900K, which I used on the Peter McKinnon build, we're getting 1320. We're good, like 10, 11, 12% better on the single core performance. You're wondering how it compares to Apple M1, then the M1 single core is better on the R23, which is 1514, which is very impressive score. But we're only just behind the M1. Now the multi-core speed, we're getting 10,591. And to be honest, it's better than the M1 Mac Mini. Roughly around 30% better. But the thing is, because it still has only 6 cores and 12 threads, any processor that has more than 8 cores or more usually performs much better. As you can see, like the 10900K, which has 10 cores, almost double the cores, gets 15,427. So still quite a good performance. Now, another thing I want to mention is it worth turning on the precision boost overdrive on this, and how much are we gaining on this? We're gaining roughly around 500 points or a little bit less, which isn't too much, but we're losing 5% of the performance over a longer period of time. So if we keep running this benchmarks for 10 minutes, we're losing 5% because, it's not so stable, and, slightly the temperature and things are rising. So we're losing 5%, which I wouldn't recommend to do. So there's not that big of a boost in enabling the precision boost overdrive. So if I was you, I would leave it off, because we're gaining quite a bit of temperature as well. So the max temperature with precision boost overdrive on is 77, whereas the same test without it off is 63. And I think it's just better to keep it a little bit cooler, even though 77 with this configuration is still a good score. And if there is someone who really wants a few percent extra from your CPU multi-core performance, then maybe it's worth doing. So the Geekbench over here, the single core is not as good as like M1, because obviously M1 is the best. That's, Geekbench 5 just loves M1 single core performance, but we're not far behind on any of the other like Ryzen 7 or 9s of the 5000 series, only maybe a few percent behind, which is amazing. In terms of multi-core performance, you can expect it to be like roughly better than Mac Mini M1, but nothing a bit more than that, nothing amazing. Blender, we're about the same, because we're 6 cores, there's not a lot of rendering performance in that. There's a lot of not enough cores to do the rendering. you can see on the screen over here, we're just scoring somewhere, you know, just below the 8-core chips and above any of the 6-core chips, because it is like one of the best 6-core chips in the world. So that's where we are. The interesting thing is the Ryzen 7 5750G, which is an 8-core CPU, we are actually better at Vector render, which is a long render. We're about 20 seconds better in there, so that's better, but the rest of the scores are a bit lower than the 8-core chip. If you're wondering like what exact parts I'm using for this build, check out the links in the description below. I'm gonna leave everything down there, so if you click on any of them, they will take you directly to these if you want to purchase any of these. But just so you know, like, how does the SSD or storage benchmark goes, we have the Kingston NV1, which is a PCIe storage SSD, and this is 500 gigabytes in size, and the read speed is 2552 and write speed 1970, which, like, in big PCIe 4 speeds isn't anything amazing, but it's still quite an okay performance and very, very good, you know, compared to a SATA SSD. Like the SATA SSD that we're running, the other one inside there, is 5 times slower. So just so you know, the operating system is quite well. Now, comparing it to the Mac M1 chip, for example, the M1 chip, if you do the Blackmagic speed test, it gets a 2745 megabytes read speed, whereas ours on the same test gets 2022, so slightly slower over there, like around 700 megabytes slower, which, you know, in these terms are, you know, measurable amount. The M1 is still faster in terms of the SSD performance, but you're paying for it as well a lot more. This is much more of the budget option. So if you're a photographer, this next section is for you. How does it perform in Photoshop and Lightroom? So looking at the Photoshop performance over here, and first of all, our overall score over here is 1091. And just to like put you in perspective, what does a 1000 score mean? So 1000 score is performed from i9 and 9900K and RTX 2080 and 64 gigabytes of RAM and the Samsung 960 Pro 1TB SSD. So that is gonna perform, and that's the baseline of this benchmark. So our 6-core absolutely is better than the 9900K from only a little while ago. So our GPU performance is 126, which is better as well than the baseline. And so is the general score, 101. And so is the filter score, 116.6. So everything is better than the baseline, which is amazing. So now you can see that our 6-core chip is actually a lot better than, you know, we might actually think. Because a few years ago, 9900K was like the top of the line, but now our bottom of the line performs better than the top of the line. And it wasn't that long ago when 9900K was like, you know, a very, very good chip. But comparing it to some of the other PCs that I have tested on this channel, for example, let's have a look at my like personal editing rig that's over there, which is the Ryzen 9 3950X. Is a 16-core chip from last generation, and testing it with the same GPU and double the amount of memory, and I'm getting about 20% lower performance because the new chip performs just so well in single-core performance. It is just so much better on Photoshop. Now, looking at the Vitamin C, which is a Ryzen 9, like one of the latest 5000 series Ryzen processors, is 1177 overall score. So if we compare this to our one, which is 1091, you can see that we're very close to performing to the Ryzen 9s. And then looking at even the Threadripper, we're better than the Threadripper, because our Threadripper Bumblebee got 1008. The Intel 10900K with RTX 2060 Super is 1038, which is still slower than ours. If we used it with the same like GPU, we're probably gonna get a similar scores with each of them. Just so you know, like this CPU is performing so well, that's why we're getting so close to this. And then the M1 is absolutely like half as fast or twice as slow. M1 score over here is 569. So it's quite a bit slower. So in terms of Photoshop, honestly, this 5600X CPU is well enough for you. It does amazing job and performs very close to the Ryzen 7, Ryzen 9s, Intel i7s, i9s from previous generations. So if you want to save some money and you're you know, using Photoshop a lot, this is going to be amazing chip for you. And whatever you see online compared to the M1 chip, if you get the M1 Mac Mini, this Ryzen chip is twice as fast as the M1. So just so you know, this is the actual performance. How well does it perform? Looking at Lightroom Classic now, our Silent ProArt over here, overall score of 1049. Which is still better than the baseline score of the PC that I mentioned before. It's exactly the same PC, i9 9900K. Our 6-core chip is better than the i9 from a little while ago. But looking at the other PCs over here, we have the Mac Pro Killer, like my personal editing PC over there. By the way, you can find all of these PCs that I'm talking about if you're just new here. All of these PCs you can find on my channel. If you type in like Tech Notice and the PC name, you'll find like a playlist of stuff that I've created about the different PCs. So my personal editing rig is scoring actually lower, which is a 16-core chip, and it's just lower. And Peter McKinnon PC, which is 10900K and double the amount of storage as we have over here, is also about 5% slower than what we have over here. Now looking at the active scores, because in Lightroom there is 2 scores. Active is basically when you're editing on a photo or working on a photo, and the passive score is when you're exporting those photos. Active score, we are scoring 97.2. The Vitamin C over here, which is Ryzen 9 5900X, like 12 core, like double the amount of cores, double the amount of threads, like much more powerful CPU, we are scoring within 1% of that PC with this PC. So as you can see, it is right up there with anything you can offer. The 10900K from previous generation, very high, you know, single score, because, you know, these programs actually like Intel's chips sometimes a little bit more. We're scoring literally 1%, you know, as high as that one as well. Any of the Threadripper chips, this little 6-core chip is actually better for Lightroom unless you're doing a lot of exporting. So all of the active scores, as you can see on all of these PCs, we're within like 1% of the active scores, which is just absolutely amazing. Now looking at the passive score, which is like rendering those and, you know, exporting those photos, we are, you know, doing very, very well again. 112.6, which is right up there with anything that I have. For example, I have the 16-core chip over there, and I'm getting only like a few percent better, maybe 1, 2, 3% better performance on the export score, even though I have almost 3 times the amount of cores and threads. So as you can see, this 6-core little one is absolutely amazing. So what is the conclusion for photographers? If you want this chip, and if you're doing a lot of like actually working on the photos, whether it's on Photoshop or Lightroom, this is going to perform like right up there with any of the Ryzen 9s and Ryzen 7s. You're probably not going to notice the difference. You're going to notice the difference once you start exporting things or actually rendering things together. Then obviously the Ryzen 7s and 9s are a little bit faster because of the just more cores. But as you can see, it's very impressive. If you're impressed and enjoying this video, hit that like button. It actually makes a difference. Our Silent ProArt now extended overall is 682. Now Premiere Pro, just so you know, likes to use a lot of cores and a lot of threads because it likes a lot of CPU performance. So because we have only 6, these days 6 isn't enough. The baseline is with Ryzen 9 5900X, so that's 12-core chip, absolutely amazing CPU, and the GPU is RTX 3080, and we have 64 gigabytes of RAM, so double the amount of RAM, a better GPU, a much better CPU, so, you know, it's all right that we're scoring close to 700 over here as the extended overall score. But you can see we're like twice as good as the Apple Mac Mini M1. The other PCs that have Ryzen 9s or things like that, they're scoring obviously much better. Even the 10900K is about 10, 15 to 20% better. So standard, as you can see, we're getting a higher score than the extended overall, because if you're using any of the standard footage from like, you know, 4K and different codecs, mirrorless cameras photos, rather than RAW and, you know, 6K, 8K and things like that, then we're scoring less because it can't do that as much because the 6-core chip over here doesn't perform as well. Extended export score, we're getting 64.4. As you can see, still much better than the M1 that scores 27.4. Extended playback score is 73.1, still performing a bit lower than the Ryzen 9, obviously. Standard live playback score is 87.8. On the GPU score, we're scoring 72, which is obviously a lot more powerful, the built-in one on the M1 chip, and these days costs more than the whole M1 computer, but it's still very, very good. It's only a little bit better than the 2060 Super, that I've tested with the Peter McKinnon build. So Premiere still likes to use CPU more than the GPU. So in conclusion, for the Premiere Pro, if you are a video editor, check out my live playback test where I'm testing a lot of different codecs. But to conclude that a little bit is that if you're doing anything below 5K, so that's 4K and less, you're going to be fine. Above 4K, you're not going to be fine. And it starts to struggle. Now let's have a look at After Effects, which uses different parts of the CPU and works a little bit different now. 1285, which is 28% better than the baseline PC, which is i9-9900K, that same PC with RTX 2080 and 64 gigabytes of RAM. Basically, we are better than the Peter McKinnon PC, which is 1200 points, which is awesome because ours has almost half the amount of cores than the Peter McKinnon PC, but still, you know, we're beating that. We're a lot better than the M1, like twice as fast as the M1 chip. Our RAM preview is 105. So because of our fast RAM, it's slightly faster than the baseline PC, but it's not as good as like some of the PCs that have more RAM, because, you know, sometimes, but still very good compared to, for example, the McKinnon PC that has twice the amount of RAM, still scores less than ours over here. Render score is 103, which is better than the 9900K. Some of the Ryzen 9s can be 15 to 20% better. Tracking score, we're getting 173, which is 73% better than the baseline PC, which is a lot better, which means that just this single core performance and the tracking of this chip is absolutely amazing. So it's better than even the 16 core Ryzen 9 3950X, which is on the Mac Pro killer, and it's faster than the Peter McKinnon PC, which is 151, and we're even faster than the Threadripper Bumblebee PC, which is 164.5, and ours is 173. So conclusion for After Effects user, this PC with the chip, this Ryzen 5 over there, performs very, very well. So if you're doing a lot of tracking or RAM preview, it's going to do really, really well. The rendering score is a little bit lower than, you know, some of the Ryzen 9. So if you're doing a lot of rendering out and things like that, you know, maybe you want to leave it overnight, it's not going to be as good as some of the chips that cost double the amount. But working on projects and working on trackings and doing things like that, it works really, really well on this chip. So last thing for the video editors, we have DaVinci Resolve, which is the free version and the studio version. Tested it on the free version at first as well. Our PC over here is getting quite good scores. So the standard overall score for the free version is 1230. So let's have a look at some of the other PCs. We have the Mac Pro killer, which is Ryzen 9 16 core chip, and it is only slightly better 1287. Vitamin C, which is a Ryzen 9 build, which we did recently, that is 1320, and the Bumblebee is 1357, and these are, you know, like 10-15% better on the free version. The awesome thing is we're still performing very, very well, especially if you look at the overall score. We're very close to the like 16 core chip that we have on my personal computer. The 4K score, we're not doing so well. We are performing and we're scoring 66, and it's way below the baseline PC, and the baseline PC is 10900K now with NVIDIA Titan RTX 24 gigabytes graphics card, and we're not performing at all as well on the 4K media score. It's just because the CPU performance isn't that good on different 4K things. On GPU effects, we're performing very, very good, similar to anything else out there, because the RTX 3070 is very good in there. Fusion score on the free version of DaVinci Resolve is 209, which is a lot better than the 10900K. So if you're doing a lot of fusion, then this chip is absolutely a beast of a machine. In fact, it is the best fusion score I've ever tested with all of the other PCs. It's absolutely amazing. The best one, or the second place, goes to the Ryzen 9 5900X from Vitamin C, and that is 195. Now moving on to the studio version, which means that it's basically going to unlock your hardware and it's not going to cripple your hardware anymore. The standard overall score now from 1230, we are getting 1387. So we're getting a little bit better, you know, extra 10-15%, something like that better, which isn't that much. So if you're editing a free version of Resolve, just feel free to use this. And if you want to, you know, save $300 or pounds on the actual software, it's not going to be that much slower. It's going to be slower, but not like marginally, like half the amount of slower. It's gonna be like 90% there. Mackinnon PC with RTX 2060 Super, we're better than that one. But the closest comparison over here, or the best one to see, is the Mac Pro Killer, and we're performing better than our 16-core chip, which is just amazing. Moving on to extended overall score, we're basically performing the same and slightly better than the 16-core Mac Pro Killer. The personal build has 1380, and our Silent ProArt over here is 1383. So 3 points better, not much, but still better. Our 4K media score is obviously lower than the 16-core chip, scoring at 106, which is still better than the 10900K, but not as good as like a Ryzen 9 with the 16 cores over there. 8K media score is a little bit slower as well. As you can see, let's compare the same PCs over here. The Ryzen 9 gets 141, whereas our Silent ProArt over here is 137. GPU effects is better on this one than on our Ryzen 9 score, and performing right up there with anything else. So if you're doing any of the GPU effects, you won't gonna notice a difference. In terms of the Fusion score, we're scoring 213, which is a little bit slower than, you know, some of the other PCs like the Ryzen 9 5900X on the Vitamin C scores 221, but we're still faster than our Ryzen 9 3950X from Mac Pro Killer, but that scores 197. So the conclusion here for video editors, if you want to do this on DaVinci Resolve, is first of all, go check out my like timeline performance of all of these different codecs. If you want to see how well does it perform on the timeline, check them out. But it scores very good scores in like anything, just because of the combination of the lower end chip and the higher end GPU for DaVinci Resolve works really well. You don't need really a Ryzen 9s or Ryzen 7s or i9s or i7s. This Ryzen 5 performs really well, and especially if you're doing a lot of Fusion stuff, it's gonna be an absolute killer. Like more than twice as fast as the 10900K, which is blows your mind. So is the Ryzen 5 5600X good enough in nowadays 2021-22 as the creator PC? And I would say absolutely. I've been super impressed with the specs. The only exclusion from like any of the benchmarks over here, I would say, is the Premiere Pro. Premiere Pro just likes a bit more cores and more CPUs, as you can see on some of the benchmarks over here. But anything else, if you're a photo editor or you're editing on DaVinci Resolve, it's going to be an absolutely awesome. So definitely recommend this build, especially how quiet and awesome this is. So this was a long analysis on the benchmarks. Thanks guys for watching. If you found it helpful, hit that like button. Hopefully enjoy this. If you have any other comments, I'll meet you in the comment section below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.